Thanks, Max. And if you've been with us over the last couple of days, you'll know that we have a Q&A at the end, so you've got numbers you can text in for that, so do feel free to do that. And if I don't get to answer your question, or if you don't think I answer your question very well, please come and grab me at the end. I'll be at the front here, and I'm very happy to chat to you and to continue the conversation. I'm not seeing this talk, as with any of the talks, as being the last word on the conversation, but hopefully a start of a conversation or continuing one as we go through. So on the first day, on Monday, we looked at truth. Do we need truth anymore? We needed that to kind of lay our foundations, I think, for the rest of the week. And then yesterday, we looked at this big question, which often philosophers phrase as, what is the good life? You know, what is the life that is worth living? And Michael looked in the evening at what is the point of life. Today, we're looking particularly at our place in that narrative as we look at this issue of identity. And is there a real you? And as we look at that, I'm going to try and attack it or look at this issue in a few different ways. First of all, I want to look at the need for a source of identity, and then look at what's behind our sources of identity and explore that a bit further. Then explore the inadequacy often of our sources of identity, and finally look at how we can have a secure and liberating source of identity. So that's kind of where we're going. Let's think first of all at the need for a source of identity. A number of years ago, there was a Head & Shoulders advert. You can tell it was a number of years ago because I've obviously not been paying attention to shampoo adverts for some time. But it had a very memorable catchphrase to it. It said this: you never get a second chance to make a first impression. You never get a second chance to make a first impression. And it was a very clever catchphrase because it really taps into this fear in some ways that we have, that when we walk into a new social context and when our identity is not known in that context, we might blow it, we might get it wrong. Now, for some of you, you've experienced this year as you arrived at university, or maybe for those of you who've been around for it, you can remember what it was like. Some, when they arrive at university, see it as a time of great liberation, maybe because the identity that they have or are known by back in their school or their hometown is one they want to change. And so university kind of gives them the context to explore and become the person they always want to become. It kind of wipes the slate clean to a degree. Others find it the opposite. They actually find it a very unsettling experience because they were the top of the class, they were the top of the school, they were well regarded, and now you arrive and you suddenly realize that you're a medium to small-sized fish in a very big pond, and that whilst you might have been top of the class in your school, you're now here amongst people who were all top of their class, right? And so where are you now in the pecking order? And so it can be very unsettling. So this pursuit of identity you often experience in those kind of social contexts. Now, social media gives us a particular opportunity, I guess, to frame our identity, and that's one of the great attractions of it. As you do your online profiles, you get to present to people the identity that you want them to perceive of you. That's pretty unique, you know, in our day and age. It's not always been like that. But the challenge with social media is that cursor kind of blinks at you, and as you write your online profile or as you decide which pictures you're going to post, is difficult, isn't it? Because what identity are you going to put forward? You know the challenge. There are kind of pitfalls either side. You want to appear confident, but not cocky and arrogant. You want people to think that you're attractive and beautiful, but not shallow. You want people to think you're ethical, but not self-righteous. And so, you know, just trying to get that exact right balance is really difficult. You know the type of posts on Facebook or Instagram which you've seen, which kind of hit the home run, but part of you wants to be sick when you read them. You know, it's like the person who's been on their gap year and they kind of post something like, just climbed Mount Kilimanjaro for charity, look at this beautiful sunset, hashtag knackered, hashtag blessed. You know, you can't hate that, because what kind of human being hates someone who does something for charity? But equally, you know, you kind of think it's just a bit too carefully crafted, right? Is it authentic? That's the question. Is it the real you? Now, when we explore this issue of identity, identity is often not reflected on, because identity is so foundational to who we are. It's a little bit like if I showed you a beautiful picture, and then I said, what do you think of the picture? And you describe the picture, and I said, now, what do you think of the camera that took the picture? Well, you might not know, but the camera was essential to the picture. But it was the lens through which you view the picture, and often we do that without really evaluating it, without thinking about it. Identity is like that. It is the lens through which we see life and through which people perceive us, but we often don't reflect on it. One of the great philosophers and thinkers of identity was Søren Kierkegaard, Danish philosopher, continental philosopher, and he said that really, if we form our identity on the wrong thing, it's not just a mistake, it is in some ways the mistake, because identity is so foundational to who we are. He wrote this: the greatest hazard of all, losing oneself, can occur very quietly in the world. as if it were nothing at all. No other loss can occur so quietly. Any other loss, an arm, a leg, $5, a wife, is sure to be noticed. Do you see what he's saying? He's saying that as you think about identity, if you get that wrong, in some ways it's the greatest mistake you can make. Get it right, it puts everything else right. So no pressure then as we try and look at this in 20 minutes. So let's see how we go. Now, as we're constructing one of the things is that in our modern and late modern society, we've had a unique opportunity to try to construct our sources of identity. I'll say a little bit more about that later. But as we do that, there are really two dominant narratives that come up about identity in culture. And I want to help you see that they are there, because often you won't have reflected on them. One narrative is be true to yourself. You know, you hear that a lot, don't you? It's kind of not only marketing slogans, but sometimes it's at a much more profound level. Be true to yourself. And that presupposes there is an essential you, I use that term technically, an essence of you that you have to discover and then be true to. There's also, that's like the modern narrative. The late modern narrative, or the postmodern narrative technically, is this. There is no essential you that you've got to be true to. You can be whoever you want to be. It's down to your choice. So that is less about discovering and uncovering your essential identity and being true to that, as more about constructing and building your identity out of nothing. You're a tabula rasa, a blank slate. Now, those two narratives are huge in our culture, and they're flying around, and they're very, very different. In fact, if you think about them, they are completely opposed to one another. Because one says there is an essential you you've got to be true to. The other one says there is no essential you. You don't have to be true to that. You just get to choose, and it's completely free and liberating up to you. And they're actually written in opposition to one another. Now, let me show you how they play out. So the be true to yourself one is the one that you would have heard a lot with the classic coming out narrative. And it's hugely significant for those who have it in their lived experience. They will often say things like, I felt like I was not being authentic to myself. I felt like I was living a lie and that no one really knew who I was. And then I discovered who I really was, and then I had the courage, and often it does require significant courage, to be true to myself and to let people know who I really am. And now I'm living it out and I'm being authentic. You must have heard that narrative. It's so common and very important. Now, take, for example, with that, Freddie Mercury. He's often seen as a torchbearer within the gay community. And one of his biography writers, Leslie Ann Jones, she discovered that as he was writing his songs, that Bohemian Rhapsody was, in many ways, though unknown to the public at the time, because he didn't want to damage his family, was his coming out song. Here's the last verse of the song, and you'll hear the narrative. Too late, my time has come, sends shivers down my spine, body's aching all the time. Goodbye, everybody, I've got to go, got to leave you all behind and face the truth. It's very powerful songwriting. He's a brilliant lyricist, but he's writing it from a lived experience. He's saying, I'm shivering about the prospect of finally revealing to the world and to people who I really am. But I've got to do it as hard as it is. I've got to leave the old me behind, and I've got to be true to myself, face the truth. Very powerful narrative. And of course, it's not just the gay lobby, but lots of people, transgender as well, live that experience of I've got to be true to myself. Now, philosophers like Michel Foucault, a postmodern, late modern philosopher, says the problem with that is that this is all about liberation. But if you are still trying to be true to yourself, how do you know that the yourself you are trying to be true to is not a social construct? And therefore, you're not actually going far enough if you want to be liberated. You need to realize there is no essential you. It's all a construct. You can be whoever you want to be. So think of Eddie Izzard, for example. He wants to dress as a man today or a woman tomorrow or something in between the next day. He gets to choose. He's not trying to be true to himself. He's just choosing. He's quite thoughtful about that. And so that is a very different type of narrative. Technically, it's what queer theory, I use the term technically, is about. It's about constructing your identity, not discovering your identity. It's about a conversation of identity that is revealed progressively, but it's completely up to you. You're a blank slate. Now, when you compare those two, I wonder if you've noticed that a lot of the culture wars that are going on are actually about how those two collide. So, for example, think back to last year, and a lot of coverage was in the press at the time at the Gender Recognition Act that was being debated in autumn of 2018. And there was a lot of debate about it because some feminist groups, not all feminism, because there's different waves of feminism, but some feminist groups were saying, look, we understand, of course, the right for people to try to choose their identity, but you can't say that if you've been a man, particularly a white middle-class man, all your life, that you are truly a woman when you choose to be, because you've not had the lived experience of being under the subjugation of the patriarchy. So if you've not experienced that, you can't claim you're fully a woman. But then some of the transgender lobby was saying, hang on, but you can't say I'm not fully a woman if I choose to be a woman, because it's up to my choice. And there were big debates behind closed doors in Parliament about this that came down to really nitty-gritty important things as who has access, for example, to a battered wives charity. Can anyone go along? What if you became a man, transitioned to become a woman 6 months ago? Can you now come along? But couldn't you potentially have been a perpetuator of abuse before? Very difficult to work this out. And the reason it's so difficult to work out is you've got two conflicting narratives. And the issue behind the issue is the narratives. Where is your identity? What forms your identity? So how do we resolve this? Well, let's try and think a little bit more carefully about what's behind our sources of identity. Behind our source of identity is a longing for security and a longing for liberty. So let me show you where these two narratives have come from. First of all, a longing for liberty. In traditional society, your identity would be down to fundamental things like your class, your nation, your ethnicity, your job, your family, your name. Now, you see it in traditional English names. Think of the name Jackson or Davidson. That shows your identity is bound up with you are the son of Jack or the son of David. Now, that's lovely if David is a great guy, but what if David shames you and the family? You carry his shame now for generations. That's not a great thing, right? Or think of names like Masterton or Smith. Masterton means you're the master of the town. Lovely to be part of that family. Smith means you bash metal for a living. By the way, if you're an engineer here today, you're welcome. It's great you're here, but not all of us want to bash metal for a living. But here's the point. You're constrained in some sense by the choices that have gone before you of other people. You don't get to be free to choose. So modernity comes in and it says we need to reject that. We need to be free to build our identity or to uncover our identity. And so suddenly you get this great liberation, which in one way is a good thing. But here's also the question. As we liberate ourselves and we get to choose our identity, is it secure enough? Because liberty without security is a form of tyranny. Have you ever been to a country where there is total liberty, but there is no secure rule of law? That's anarchy, and that's awful. So you need security as well. Actually, Carl Rogers, the humanist psychologist, talked very significantly about the need that all human beings have for unconditional positive mental regard. Unconditional positive mental or just unconditional positive regard, which is saying that when you find out who you really are, there's a need for it to be accepted. And healthy human beings are those who not only know who they are, but feel acceptance on the basis of who they are. Which is why it's so important that people who are in minority groups, when they are able to say, this is who I am, push society to say, accept me. That's because they want the security of being accepted. Otherwise, what's the point? So security and liberty lie behind these. But one of the great problems is that when we seek to construct our identity on something like that, we don't actually get the security and the liberty that we're really after. To help you see that, it might be a surprise to you that Jesus talked a lot about identity and had a lot to say about it. And I want you, if you'd be willing, to take up these little Luke's Gospels. This is, Luke was one of the people who investigated the eyewitness accounts of Jesus' life and wrote this gospel on the basis of eyewitness testimony. And turn to page 35. And here Jesus exposes the inadequacy of the sources of our identity. Page 35, chapter 10, and we're looking at the number 17, verse 17 on page 35. The context here is that Jesus has sent out his disciples, 72 or 70 in some manuscripts, and they've returned. So he sent them out on mission, and they returned to report how it's all gone. And as they return, verse 17, they say, Lord, even the demons submit to us in your name. In other words, they're saying, it's been fantastic. They're using the kind of supernatural vernacular of the day. They say, we've been sent out on mission and we've seen amazing things. It's been a time of unprecedented success and fruitfulness. So they're celebrating. And Jesus backs them up. He says, yes, I saw Satan fall like lightning from heaven. He doesn't dampen their enthusiasm, and if anything, he gives it more. He says, I've given you authority to trample on snakes and scorpions and to overcome all the powers of the enemy. Nothing will harm you. But look at the warning here in verse 20. However, do not rejoice that the spirits submit to you, but rejoice that your names are written in heaven. Now, here he's digging into identity. In the literal Greek, it doesn't actually say, do not rejoice that your name, that the Spirit submit to you. It says, do not rejoice in this. And there's a very obvious preposition in the Greek. Now, there's a difference between rejoicing that something happens and rejoicing in something. To rejoice in something means you find your identity in that thing. So if I win a rugby match, which I very rarely did, but if I won a rugby match, I could rejoice that I've won the rugby match. But if I rejoice in the fact that I've won the rugby match, I'm attaching my identity to it. Now here's the thing, whenever you build your identity on something, or whenever you build in general on something, the key question is, can it bear the weight? Right, you get that. I mean, in architecture, if you build on foundations, can those foundations bear the weight? It's true physically, it's true metaphysically. If you build your identity on something, this is you, can it take the weight? That's a key question. Jesus says, don't build your identity on anything apart from the fact that your names are written in heaven. Why? Because implicitly he says it can't bear the weight. Now, I want to try and show you why that's true. Think of liberty. We talked about security and liberty being two fundamental drivers we have in our search for identity. So the first thing is, can it bear the weight of giving you the freedom you long for? Well, let's say you build your identity on, for example, your academic achievement, as lots of people do, or on your popularity, as lots of people do, or maybe on your sexual orientation, as lots of people do, or maybe on your choices. I make these choices. Does it give you the liberty? Can it bear the weight of your expectation of liberty? Well, here's the question. What happens if you lose it? You haven't just lost, for example, out and not doing so well on an essay or not doing so well in the labs. If you lose some of your friends, if your identity is predicated on that, you haven't just lost a few friends. There's a sense in which you've lost yourself. A friend of mine, when he lost his job in the city, he was a senior partner in a management consultancy firm, and I remember I was meeting with him pastorally and asking him how it was going and how was the job search going, and he said this to me. He said, Pete, since I've lost my job, I just don't feel like I know who I am anymore. You see, he's not just lost his job. Because his job was his identity, he's lost himself. That is arguably the greatest tragedy of all. And so if you choose to predicate your identity on something that you construct like that, even something which might be very foundational to who you are, like your gender or like your sexual preferences, here's the question, what if it's sexual preference, what if you never find someone to really reciprocate that? Does that mean you're never truly whole? That would be awful, and many people are experiencing that and feel that. Jesus Christ would say, no, you can be fully whole even if you never find the context to fully reciprocate that, because it doesn't define you. If it's on the basis of your choices, the late modern identity, what if you make the wrong choices? The pressure on every choice is immense, because every choice isn't just a choice. It's a definition of who you are. The weight on your shoulders that weighs you down is enormous. That is not liberation. So do you see that when you choose to try to construct your identity on something else, good as it may be, it can't bear the weight of your expectations. It won't liberate you. And secondly, it won't be secure enough for you, because eventually it will crumble and crack under the weight of expectations, because here's the punchline. You were never intended to build yourself on something, on anything else, apart from who you are in relation to God. A foundational Christian scriptural doctrine is that we as human beings are made in the image of God. That means that our identity is an extension and an overflow of the nature of God. Just as a masterpiece can't be detached from the artist who painted it, so we are God's masterpieces, and our identity flows out from the love and the grace and the nature of God. And so when Jesus says this, rejoice that your names are written in heaven, he's saying let that be your secure and liberating sense of identity. Let me show you how that works. If you don't build your identity on Jesus Christ, then you end up not being liberated and not being satisfied. David Foster Wallace, who died in 2008, was an author, and he spoke to a cohort of graduating students, so it seems apt to talk to you similarly today. This is what he wrote. He said, here's something else that's true. In the day-to-day trenches of adult life, there is no such thing as atheism. There is no such thing as not worshipping. Everyone worships something. The only choice we get is what to worship. If you worship money and things, if they are where you tap real meaning in life, then you will never have enough. Never feel you are enough. It's the truth. Worship your own body and beauty and sexual allure. You will always feel ugly. And when the time and age starts showing, you will die 1,000,000 deaths before they finally plant you. On one level, we all know this already. It's been codified as myths, proverbs, cliches, epigrams, parables. It is the skeleton of every great story. The trick is keeping the truth up front in daily consciousness. He uses the language of worship rather than identity, but they're interchangeable because worship comes from the English etymology of worth-ship, that which you ascribe ultimate worth to in your life. In other words, it's not just Christians and religious people who worship. Everyone worships something, and the big question is, are you worshiping the right thing? Well, how does worshiping Jesus Christ liberate you? Well, it liberates you because it gives you the security you need. Did you notice Jesus says, your names are written in heaven? Rejoice in that. Your name in the ancient societies, I've already said, is the foundation of who you are. And Jesus says your name is written in heaven. Now, who dwells in heaven? Even if you've never read the Bible, you know the answer to that. God. So when he says your name is written in heaven, he's saying God chooses to allow you to reside with him in the most intimate relationship. Here's the question underpinning a lot of our searches for identity. If we never really show someone the true us, then we can never really be loved for who we are. And that, in some senses, is the greatest tragedy of all human existence. But what would it be like if I was able to show someone the true me, the real me, warts and all, mistakes and all, behind the social media profiles, the filters off, everything about me, and at that moment, that person who knew you, the real you, behind the masks, behind all of the social performance, at that moment, that person loved you perfectly, accepted you unconditionally. Would that not be ultimately liberating? When Jesus says, rejoice that your names are written in heaven, he's saying God knows you, God sees everything about you, and God welcomes you into his home in heaven, and therefore you're liberated. And you say, well, that sounds nice. How do you know that? You know that because of where Jesus is going as he says this. He's going to the cross. And on the cross, he bears our broken source of identity. For those who fear being ugly, he becomes cosmically disfigured on the cross, despised and rejected as the prophet talks about him, so that we can be ultimately beautiful in the sight of God. For those who construct their identity on the basis of performance, he looks like a cosmic failure on the cross, mocked and spat upon, rejected even by his Father, so that he can pay for the way that we have chosen to build our identities on other things and not on God. For those who want complete freedom, he takes the consequence of what that anarchy really feels like, experiencing the judgment of God on the cross so that we can be accepted and experience the security and liberation that we were all made for. And notice how he says your names are written in heaven. In other words, it's a contract. It's secure. You can't undo it. Because you can't throw something away that was never conditional on your performance to get it. It's guaranteed by what he does on the cross. It's not down to you. And therefore it is secure and liberating. And this is the key. And I do hope you can come back tonight here, because Michael's going to talk about how when we get that sense of identity central in our lives, it works from inside out to change us. Many of you will have lots of questions. What could this mean? What will it mean for my lifestyle choices? What about what I should live? I want to say to you, get the identity central first, and then listen to how it changes and works out into all other areas. I want to end by quoting a poem to you by Dietrich Bonhoeffer. If you know anything about Dietrich Bonhoeffer, you'll probably know that he was an objector to Nazi Germany, and even that he thought about how best to deal with the evil of Hitler and whether he should be assassinated. He was also an academic great and highly regarded in society and a Christian, and he was put in prison. Everything was stripped away from him. All his source of identity, his family, his belongings, his academic prestige, and from prison he wrote this poem. It's called Who Am I? I want you to listen at what he's grappling with and where he lands in the poem. Who am I? This or the other? Am I one person today or tomorrow another? Or am I both at once, a hypocrite before others, and before myself a contemptible, woebegone weakling? Or is something within me still like a beaten army, fleeing in disorder from victory already achieved? Who am I? They mock me, these questions of mine. Whoever I am, thou knowest, O God, for I am thine. Let me hand back to Max.
Great, thanks. Great, thanks so much, Pete. Pete will be back up in just a couple of minutes' time to answer your questions. Whilst you're texting in your final questions, let me just make you aware of the small little white feedback slips. We'd love to hear any comments you have about today, what was helpful, what could be done better. In particular, there is a box if you have been really interested by what Peter's been saying about these Christian claims about identity, then and would like to find out more, then do fill in your details and tick the Tell Me More box. Nothing scary will happen. Nobody's going to knock around on your door, but someone will just send you an email with where you can take that from there. But I'll give you a couple of minutes to do that and text in your final questions now, and we'll be back up in a sec. Thanks very much. First question that's coming for you, Pete. If I have depression, is the real me on my medication or me without my medication? And if my medication is currently making my depression worse, is how I am currently the real me, or is the real me a me where I'm on a medication that works?
Thank you. Look, that's a really difficult question. In some ways, it's hard and abstract because I'd love to talk to you personally. So if you'd be brave enough, I'd love to chat to you afterwards. And I hope you're getting support from professionals and also your friendship group with that. But let me try and say a few things. So yeah, in terms of identity, there is of course a real and coherent you. It's not a question whether it's the real you. I think the question is whether it's the right you. Okay, because you can be real but not on the right path. You can be real and authentic. Authenticity, but actually it's not the you that ultimately you would choose to be. It's not the right you. And one of the things that of course is required in any mental diagnosis is actually to say that there is an optimum of a healthy human self. It's of course, we can't make medical diagnoses unless we have an idea of what healthy looks like. So someone battling with depression under the Christian view would of course be someone who is authentically themselves, someone who is loved and made in the image of God. Nothing has changed about that, but it is not the you that God ultimately intends for you. And so there is a sense of a trajectory of change that you're going on to. Now, many, many Christians, if you read the Psalms, for example, at least a number of the Psalms clearly seem to be written by people grappling with depression. And one of the wonderful things that God would say into that context is, the things you are facing, the battles you are facing, don't define the ultimate you. You are not defined by your illness or by your mental state at that time. What defines you is being made in the image of God, and what defines you is the grace of God given to your life. And so he says, from that position of security, whilst being authentic about your experience, I'm going to help you to change. Okay, so I'd want to say to that person, your identity is not defined by the illness, but it is still the real you, but God is going to help you, to live through that and walk through that in a relationship with him.
Great. Next one. I believe culture can't be completely correct when it says you're free to choose your identity. Surely it must be based on fixed things that are part of your life. But also it can't be completely wrong, because if your identity was fixed, you would have no choice.
Great. Really helpful. Look, I didn't get the chance to go into this, but one of the unique things about our identity flowing out from God is that to be made in the image of God, the question is, what is God's nature? Well, God is not a monad. He's not just one. He is one God, but he is diverse within himself in three persons. And that unity and diversity gives the actual human psyche the unique kind of elbow room for development, but also the appropriate amount of security. So if God is just one God, then you would expect uniformity for all beings, right? Because if God is one God and he makes everything in his image, then that one God is just the same everywhere. So you would just have uniformity. But if God is just diverse and therefore pluralistic and diverse, then you would expect, absolute diversity, but there's no coherence to it. So how do you have the security and the liberty? Well, one God in three persons gives you that. It's not incidental, it's essential to who you are, because God gives you the unity in your being of who you really are in him, but also gives the diversity for us to be different, and we are different. And we see that around creation, not just in human beings, but we also see that with animals and the great diversity. There is a glory to that. There needs to be sufficient coherence around it. That's the one God, but there also needs to be sufficient diversity. And I put it to you that only the Christian worldview gives you that. But I'd love you to come and push back on me later and talk about that.
That's great. Next question, along similar lines, but isn't religion just as flimsy a foundation, if not more so than anything you mentioned? Following on from this, if you stake your identity on an intangible God that you cannot touch, see, talk, to or ever hear a reply from, then as soon as you lose your trust, that gives you an existential crisis.
Very helpful. Yeah, and the key thing is the if at the end. Can I just read that back to you? This is the if. If you stake your identity on an intangible God, that you cannot touch, see, talk to, or ever hear a reply from, then as soon as you lose your trust, that gives you an existential crisis. Very true, but the big if. So John, who wrote John's Gospel, when he writes his first letter, 1 John, he says this: that which we have seen, that which we have heard, that which we have touched, this we proclaim to you concerning the word of life. In other words, he's saying God is not abstract. God is not just a thought experiment. God became flesh. That is very, very tangible. And therefore, God's revealed himself in the authoritative witness of Scripture. That is very tangible. And God does answer prayer. That is very tangible. So the big if there, I totally agree with you, but I'd say this is not a human project of man-centered religion. This is a divine project of God revealing himself in space, time, and history in a very tangible way. You don't get more tangible than a person, than a baby. I've got two. You know, Jesus was a baby. That's what we've been celebrating at Christmas. They're very tangible. So he's tangible, and he's still tangible in the metaphysical sense today and still can interact with you and does interact through Scripture and through prayer and in the life of the believers around you. So it's not just a thought experiment, therefore it's not a pregnant if. It's that he has done that.
Great, in time for one final question. If you're able to freely choose what to base your identity on, then on what grounds, other than your true identity, can you make this choice?
Very clever. Do you get that, all philosophers in the room? Nice circular question. If you don't, then chat to me afterwards and I'll try to show you if I can unfathom it, how it's circular. So the fact that you are making a choice from your particular position doesn't negate the fact that, doesn't mean that you're going to be making the wrong choice. You know, we're not starting from a neutral position. And indeed, this is one of the great questions. As you come in today, Michael spoke very eloquently about this a couple of nights ago on Monday. As you come and as you evaluate the claims of Christianity, no one is neutral. We're not trying to choose from a neutral position to step into a source of identity. We already have a source of identity, and we're evaluating that against the alternative. So here's the question. When you're looking at two foundations for a building, you've got to evaluate them. Is one more certain than the other? And then you make your choice on the basis of that. If you're here thinking you're neutral, like an atheist, and I'm choosing whether to step into religion, no, you're not neutral. You have a faith position. You have a foundation identity you're building on. The question is that foundation more secure, more liberating than the alternatives? And I'm putting before you the Christian alternative. So please do evaluate your position and evaluate the alternative I've put before you and ask yourself this question. Which one gives you what you really want, the liberty and the security that I've tried to argue that you really want? And my proposition to you, but you're thinking people, you need to grapple with this yourself, as I had to do myself and keep doing, is that Christianity and the person of Jesus Christ gives you the liberty and security you really want, and there's nothing else that compares it. But of course, you need to make your own decision and evaluate it yourself. If you're thinking people, you can do that.
Wonderful. Thanks, Pete. Why don't we give Pete a round of applause? That's great, and as we wrap up this part of the lunchtime, and don't feel like you have to rush off, this place is going to turn into a cafe-esque area where you can continue those conversations if you'd like to do that. There will be tea and coffee. In particular, over right here in the corner, there'll be an optional discussion to pursue some of these thoughts about identity in literature a little bit more. And that'll be led by Mike Hood, who is an ex-Selwyn English graduate and also a spoken word poet. So, Mike, do you want to just share a couple of things about what's going to be going on?
Yeah, great. So we express and actually validate our sense of identity through literature, whether that's just sort of singing along to This Is Me from The Greatest Showman, which has been stuck in my head for at least a month now, or whether it's a kind of poem or story that we particularly resonate with and cherish. And what we'll be doing over there is just kind of looking at a few bits of literature, including This Is Me, some secular, some Christian, and kind of looking at it, seeing what resonates with us, and using that to explore what we actually need in terms of identity and where we get that from, and think about kind of what actually works in lived experience. So I'd love to chat to you about that.
Wonderful. Thanks, Mike. Do join him. It'll just be over here in this corner afterwards. Finally, a couple of things. If you have to rush off but would like to take this matter further in your own time, then there'll be a range of literature just at the back of the building. For guests, that's free for you to take away. So do take the opportunity to do that. And secondly, if you haven't had a chance to fill in a white feedback form but would like to do that, I'd like to encourage you to do that as well. Finally, these events will be happening right throughout the week, every lunchtime and every evening, and I'd like to make you particularly aware of this evening. There'll be a dinner for international students that will be back at St Andrew the Great Church. That will be at 6:30. And following that, Pete mentioned earlier, Michael Ramsden will be coming to explore these matters of identity a little bit further, and that will be at 8 o'clock. So I hope to see you there. Until then, have a great afternoon. Thanks very much for coming.